It is recording now. So we're going to talk about gait today. All right. So what do you guys know about gait so far from Intro to Kines? I'm hoping you realize it's complicated. The gait cycle. Okay, good. Right? How many different types of gait cycle are there? Trendelenburg, good. Right, so we have, and remember, you have those two different terms. You have the RLA and you have the traditional cycle, which just makes life so much fun. We're going to talk about why those two are important today. And the main focus we're going to really kind of hit on is we're going to briefly kind of hit that 1,000-foot overview of the regular gait, and we're going to start hitting some abnormal gait as primarily the thing we're going to look at. So here's all kinds of tools we can use to measure gait. Right? I always love these little cool little dots you can use to measure people's gait and stuff like that and balance. I was in a research study where we used that, and it looks really cool and it looks really awesome and it maps everything, but it is a pain in the butt to set up. But we have pressure plates, which is what this guy over here is standing on, right? That allows us to measure force. Overall, though, when you're walking, right, in general, we're going to have equal force, or should have equal force, on both feet. We should have an arch. Like these feet up here look pretty good. These little feet print up here. You got a nice arch. And normally what we would do in this case, if we were doing, I started this lecture, is we would do a gait example where I'd have all of you guys walk kind of on a piece of brown paper, and we put baby powder down, you walk through it, and we'd see how bad people's gait patterns are. Because I know we're going to have some people in this class that have really, really high arches. And then we're going to have some people like me that don't have arches at all, that just plant down and the whole foot slaps down on the floor. And it's just interesting to look at everyone's gait. No one's gait is 100% perfect, right? We all have our little twitches and hinges as we walk. So the definitions of terms for this, the gait cycle, right? Gait cycle includes stride length. The time that one foot touches the floor to the time that the same foot touches the next floor. That is called your stride. Your step is 1/2 of a stride. It's the distance between heel strike of one foot to the heel strike of the other foot. Those are important terms to get because your boards love to ask you questions talking about stride versus step. So you have to pay attention to what they're talking about, because if you don't, it's really easy to confuse those two. Stance phase is our major phase, where we have 60% of our time spent where one foot's in contact with the ground. And then we have swing phase, where there's no contact with the ground with foot. Do we ever have a phase where both feet are in swing phase? Maybe running, okay. That's about it. Right? What about with both in stance phase? Do we ever have that? Do we ever have it where both feet are in contact with the ground? Yeah, walking, right? We do have it. So the main thing here is, don't think that you have to have double swing. Swing usually only happens, especially in, about 6 miles an hour and faster running is where you kind of encounter that double swing phase. But much less than that, usually it's just normal phase, right? So here's the left and right gait cycle, right? Our stride length is where one foot, right? So we have, let me get my little annotator up here. We have 1 foot and then 1 foot. And then step is just where 1 foot and then the other foot comes in. That's kind of the idea, right? So it's just important to understand the difference between step and stride. If you don't get that, and I got a phone call and it's going to get muted. If you don't get that, that's really difficult to answer a question specific on that if you don't understand the difference. So you need to make sure you understand the difference between step and stride. So other terms, single support. Single support is when we only have 1 foot in contact with the ground, and double support is where both feet. Non-support is where neither foot is in contact with the ground. If you see a question that's talking about non-support, you should automatically assume that the patient is running, because non-support only falls into play with running. I don't see us, unless you're on one of those, what's the Tony Little exercise machine that goes back and forth that looks like an elliptical, but it's not. Maybe that's the only time you could be in a non-support phase running, but It's a great commercial for Enterprise. So here's where we're talking about the whole gait cycle, right? We have 6% of your gait cycle being stance phase and 40% being swing phase, right? And this kind of walks you through where you're in swing and when you're in stance. This is a really good slide if you don't understand the difference between the two. But the main thing here, we're looking at this. Are we looking at traditional gait cycling here? Or are we looking at RLA Rancho's gait cycling? What are we looking at here? Okay, so the difference between traditional gait cycle and Rancho gait cycle. Traditional is structural based. It is looking at the structure and function of gait. RLA is looking at the neurological function of gait. You're going to find out really quick that the Ranchos Los Amigos building or company or whatever, their job is to purely look at neurological dysfunction. They do, there's all kinds. You think that the gait is the only RLA scale. It's not. There's RLA scale for brain damage. There's RLA scale for strokes. So RLA will keep coming back as we're going through all of this. Just understand that in the gait cycle, it's looking at the neurological involvement of the neuromuscular function of gait. Whereas your traditional phase is pretty much just looking at the structure and where you're at. So weight acceptance is at the beginning of stance phase. That's where the foot touches the ground and weight begins to shift onto the leg. Single leg support, body shifts completely on the stance phase. And then leg advancement is when we're swinging through. So here's looking at RLA versus traditional gait cycle, right? So our heel strike in traditional is initial contact in RLA. And if you look at that, initial contact sounds more fancy. And a lot of the RLA scale looks fancy, right? So we have foot flat is where we get into loading response. Mid stance, good news is, doesn't matter which question you're asked about there, mid stance is mid stance. Terminal stance is where the heel starts picking up, and then pre-swing is where that toe comes off. I kind of made this slide because this slide really helps just looking at what you're looking at. So here's looking at them with the body and person in front, right? So we have our heel strike, right? Heel strike is when that heel first touches down. When that heel first touches down, you should have a little bit of dorsiflexion going on, right? Because what you're going to want to do is eventually roll through. So it's one of the problems you'll have a lot with times with kids is kids won't hit heel strike. What will they walk on? Exactly. Good Lord. Yes, 3 o'clock was too early to get up this morning. Yeah, they walk on their toes, right? And it's common you'll hear a term toe walker for kids. And there are a couple of different reasons for that, right? So one of the reasons is kids just have naturally super tight gastrocs. And sometimes that'll resolve naturally. If it seems to be a pathological reason where we can't get it corrected, walking on your toes is a sign that you may have had some sort of anoxic event in childbirth, and they could have CP. Walking on toes is a pretty big sign of CP. Now, does that mean that if you have a kid right now or your sister has a kid right now and they're walking on their toes or they've got CP? Not necessarily. But it is a sign of CP if it's in addition to other pathological conditions. So foot flat and or loading response, right? Here's foot flat. Guess what happens at foot flat? The foot is flat. Yeah, right? And when we talk about loading response, what loading response literally means is if you look, the knee is slightly bent. The foot is getting ready to accept all of the body weight. So that's why it is loading response. The next phase we go into, which comes right after that, is mid stance. And at mid stance, we kind of have the body straight up and down on that leg. Right? And once we're there, we're going to start rolling through again. And now the heel's starting to pick up. Right? So we're starting to activate these gastrocs here. Big gastroc. And the gastrocs are going to start firing off and pulling that heel off. And that's also called terminal stance because that's the last time that that foot is in kind of contact with the ground. And then toe off is, again, where we start picking the toe up. And then in the case of Rancho scale, that's pre-swing. So here's kind of looking through it when we look through moving through it. You can almost do a motion capture with this. Look at this. Fancy. Sorry, just had to. I had fun with that one. When we're in swing phase, the traditional scale has acceleration, mid-swing, and deceleration. So acceleration is when we pick up speed. Mid-swing is when we're in the middle of swinging, obviously. And deceleration is where we're starting to get ready to put the foot down. Well, they're not too different in ranchos. We have initial swing, which is when we're starting, mid-swing again, and then terminal swing. Terminal swing sounds like something that a kid's going to fall off a playground or something. They're in the terminal swing. So here's acceleration. We're starting to put through. Mid-swing, our foot's off the ground, right? Here, foot's off the ground. And then deceleration, we're getting ready for that heel strike to happen. All right, so next thing we need to talk about is vertical horizontal displacement with the walking base, everything like that, lateral pelvic tilt, and reciprocal arm swing. So all of this comes into play to normal gait. Vertical displacement, that means the distance that we go up and down. Here's a good thing to remember. In vertical displacement, it's about 2 inches. So if you were to hold a chalk piece like that lady's holding there and walk along, you would get about a 2-inch vertical displacement during normalized gait. The highest is at mid-stance when our knee is locked. The lowest is at heel strike. The good news is with horizontal displacement, you only have to remember the same number. It's about a 2-inch displacement, right? And horizontal displacement is kind of the side-to-side movement, and it forms a sine wave. It also indicates the width of base of support. So when we're walking, about how far apart are our feet when we're walking? Now, some of you will go, my feet are definitely further apart than 2 inches. Well, that may just be your base of support's a little different. But on average, there's going to be about a 2-inch gap side to side when you're walking. Pelvic tilt. This person's kind of disturbing looking. Pelvic tilt occurs when one of the legs is removed, right? Typically during pre-swing. It causes a vertical displacement of the pelvis. What muscle is really important here for pelvic tilt, specifically lateral pelvic tilt during gait? What's the big muscle? Well, flexors a little bit, not so much for the tilt, pelvic tilt. What muscle is involved in Trendelenburg? You remember from that? So as I was saying, no. Let's go a little bit further and see if I can give you a hint. What muscles are out there? Right, which glute particular on the side? Glute med, good, right? Glute med is our Trendelenburg muscle. Glute med and a little bit of TFL, but if you ever actually dissect TFL out, TFL is only about like that big, a little tiny muscle. It's more tendinous insertion than it is actual muscle. But glute med is a pretty beefy, thick muscle, right? When you get flank steak, a lot of time what you're getting is the glute med of the cow. We're going to attempt to remove or make steak horrible for everyone now, right? Psoas, believe it or not, I don't know if you guys know this, but does anyone know what muscle psoas is in steaks, or what steak muscles, or what steak psoas is? Psoas is filet mignon. That's why it's so tender. It is. That's why it's so tender, is because cows don't walk upright. Right? Think about it. Cows walk on all fours, so psoas is a very underused muscle. And that makes that muscle very, very kind of tendery. And not as tendinous as the other stuff. That's why you get that kind of like nice butter cut when somebody cooks it right. Right? So when you go to when you go down to, Fogo de Chao or any of those, just look at them and go, I'd like the cow's psoas, please. And I'm sure they'll know exactly what you're saying. Anyway, back to vertical displacement. So vertical displacement, again, is that 2-inch up and down side, right? But as we bring one leg up, we've got to laterally tilt the pelvis. So one side of the pelvis is going to go down, one side is going to go up in order to allow the foot to come through, right? If we don't do that, the foot can't swing through. The major muscle is that responsible for that is your glute med. That is knee. There. Right, so your glute med is the major thing that's responsible for it. Now, in order to do that, you have a little bit, what's the muscle up here in the ribs that probably helps? What's the one that up there that attaches to the spinal bodies? Not serratus, serratus is up here. What's the one that's deep in the back there? Oh, come on. Somebody's got to get it. Okay, obliques are here. Obliques are in the front. They're shallow. Rectus is here. Quadratus lumborum. There we go. Good. Right? The lumbar quadrant. Quadratus lumborum. You're going to say that. Yeah, exactly, right? So quadratus lumborum looks something, let me erase these because you can't see. Quadratus lumborum looks something like this. It's a quadrant, and it attaches onto the pelvis and goes up to the spinal bodies, right? That helps a little bit. If we have poor glute med, a lot of time what they'll do is they'll compensate by really contracting QL. But this is going to create a vertical displacement. And remember, vertical displacement and lateral displacement are how large? 2 inches. Good, right? And make sure you read my questions. Because what do you think the first answer is going to be on your multiple choice? If you are a betting person, 2 feet or 2 centimeters. And you're going to see 2 and go, that's it. It's A. And lose points. 2 inches or 2 feet, right? Make sure you read it properly. Don't lose easy points because Mr. McKeever is playing Mr. McKeever on you. So reciprocal arm swing. This guy looks like he's getting a good workout going, right? The arm swings with the opposite leg. Why do we do this arm swing? What's the point of arm swing? What's the major point of arm swing? Balance, forward momentum, right? And there's one other major one. And you'll find out if you don't arm swing. So what I want you to do at some point, go for a run. And when you run, try to hold your arms steady to your side. And don't let them swing. Stabilization and energy conservation, right? That forward momentum swing reduces the amount of energy you actually have to exert to move, right? And you'll find this, if you hold your arms straight down to your side and walk, it's actually tiring. Because at that point, your leg has to be responsible for all the forward momentum and also for all the stabilization, and it wears you out. Typically, when we see somebody that's losing all arm swing, is we start thinking that they're starting to get something like Parkinson's, because Parkinson's, the loss of reciprocal arm swing is really common in somebody that has Parkinson's. So we kind of watch for that. You can notice if we ever do get back to class again, I will not be offended if you're checking out my gait. You'll notice that my left arm doesn't swing as much as my right arm, and it's because of the nerve damage. It's not that it doesn't intentionally, it just doesn't do it because it's not getting the right neuro input. That leads, especially when I'm running, to more fatigue. Normalizing arm swing tends to improve gait, right? I don't know if did you guys have this in elementary school? Because when I was in elementary school, this is one of the things we worked on when I was in 1st and 2nd grade. I remember it specifically that we'd walk across the gym and our PE instructor would be yelling at us, swing your arms, swing your arms. It was to get us to normalize arm swing. Maybe they don't do that anymore, and that might explain a lot with kids today. But man, that was like 2 whole gym classes of that, and that was so much fun, especially for a chunky kid like me. I love doing multiple laps in the gym. It made me happy. So age-related changes in gait. With a child, well, children typically have a wider base of support. So that horizontal displacement, again, is 2 inches. Children typically have a wider displacement. Well, why do you think kids have a wider displacement than adults? Right, trying to balance. They don't have that whole neuro input yet. They're still kind of getting the gist of things, right? They don't quite understand how things are working. So they tend to walk with a wider balance. Their cadence is faster. And there's a lot of studies that have shown that they develop this cadence to try to keep up with adults. It's not necessarily that they want to have a faster cadence, meaning they walk faster. It's that, excuse me, they really try to keep up with adults. And you can see this, especially like you have a, one of those copycat kids that's walking with you, that they're trying to match your step length and they can't do it. It's always so cute, but at the same time, you're like, stop it, please. Their stride length is shorter, obviously, because their legs are shorter. That initial contact is typically more of a flat foot or up to the toes, depending upon what we're looking at. And that's why we got to work with them to get proper heel strike. If you don't teach a kid proper gait cycling, it develops bad habits. And we know, if nothing else, bad habits are really what? Yeah, bad, good. That's why they're called bad. They're really hard to do, hard to get rid of, right? So if your kid gets in this where it's just constantly coming down and flat foot, flat foot, flat foot, flat foot, and you don't teach them, okay, hit with the heel, roll through to the toes. Hit with the heel, roll through to the toes. Hit with the heel, roll through to the toes. They can develop a really bad habit. And if you're interested in doing pediatrics, you'll be doing this a lot. I swear, 90% of my gait cycling is just heel down to the toes, heel down to the toes. And they make these really cute things that you can put on the kid's heel. They're these little round things that you put, and every time they step down, they make animal noises. So there's ones that make lions growls, there's ones that makes frog croaks. I want them for adults because I think it would help me even with stroke patients. But when they plant down, it like rivets if they do it right. So the goal is to make the kid get his shoes to rivet. It's why also a lot of those light up shoes are designed that when you make maximum heel contact, they light up. It was the shoe manufacturer's idea to do that in order to help do proper gait cycling. So bravo to them, and thank you for giving us all seizures from those shoes. Does anyone have a kid with those shoes? And find your kids in the dark, right? Yeah, except for when all the kids have those shoes on and you're like, which one's mine? None of them. They're all parasites. They typically have short, choppy steps with no reciprocal arm swing. And if you ever want to see kind of bad kind of cycling, have your kid run. And just watch. If you have a kid, tell them to run out in the yard and run backwards. And just watch it. It doesn't look normal. I don't know how to describe it, but kids just run really funny. Right? Have you guys ever actually watched kids run? Maybe it's just this is my job, but it's amazingly funny to watch them swinging their arms way out wide to run, and everything's a game to a kid. Even correcting their gait cycle can be a game to them, which is it's so fun. But then you end up with like the adults, like watching your drink front. You're exactly correct. It really is. Right? And I imagine with doing softball and that, it's even better to watch them run to like first base. That's got to be hilarious. I should really go watch some kids' baseball games just so I can laugh. I'm not here because I'm weird. I'm here to check out their gait. That won't get Metro called on me at all. All right, so older adults. As we have our middle age and we start getting older. All right, here we have a cute couple. In this picture, this couple here was married for almost 55 years. Did you know that? And 5 days later, they both died. I'm just joking. That was kind of morbid. That was dark humor. Sorry, guys. So what happens when we get older? Well, we start developing the fear of falling. What will instill in us the fear of falling? What do you think is going to cause us to start being afraid of falling? Yeah, falling, right? Almost once you get to, your 60s, especially when you get into 65 and older, it's not if you fall, it's when you fall. Most adults, honestly, when you're that age group, even below that, most adults fall on average 2 to 3 times a year. I've fallen and I can't get up. I'm a medical alert based on them. Okay. Actually, now that I don't know if you guys know, I keep selling these the stupid Apple Watch. The Apple Watch actually has a fall detection feature in it now, which is really cool to me. Like that could potentially be a game changer for older adults. You can actually program it. Yeah. So I'm saying it detects falls and it can actually call for help, which is like, to me, that's an amazing thing that could help out old people, right? Think about that. Like if you have, grandma or something like that that's 75 that's home alone, right? Life alert could be in trouble. And you don't want to, now the problem is you have to remember to charge these things, and well, you have to remember where the watch is, and if they have Alzheimer's, that the watch might be like in the shower somewhere. But it's pretty cool to think about that they're developing this type of stuff that'll help detect falls. Even the new Life Alert bracelets and the Life Alert little pendants have a gyro sensor in them that detects falls. So that's actually pretty cool. I mean, this is stuff we've had to develop because we know that older people fall. Now, the question is, does that increase our population density because now older people are living longer? Maybe they shouldn't have. I don't know. That's a discussion for another day. Overall, decreased muscle mass. As you get over 40, I don't care what the guy on YouTube tells you about, I'm 65 and I'm in the best shape of my life. No, you're not. You don't have near the amount of sarcomeres that you had when you were 20. You don't have near the amount of sarcomeres you had when you're 40, right? As we crest 40, everything starts going downhill. So anyone that's in that age range, I'm sorry, that you're on that downward slope of that roller coaster. The only thing you can really do is flatten that curve out a little bit, like we tried to do with COVID. And now we're picking it up, sadly. We're at like a 200% increase today, guys. 200% increase. Anyway, they tend to walk slower, right? And as we walk slower, the slower we walk, the slower we end up walking. It's really strange because you start walking slower and then you start noticing things about your gait cycle as an older adult. Like, oh, I'm not doing that really well. I'm not doing that really well. So then you start walking even slower, right? And if you ever need proof of this, go to like a mall on mall walking time. And just you either have 1 or 2 people walking around the mall. You have that power mom that's walking around the mall just chugging along, right? Hips are going like 5 meters displacement. Or you have the little old lady and the little men who are walking around at like 1 mile an hour. Yeah, they drive. Well, why do they drive slow? What do you think causes old people to drive scared, right? Because their visual field isn't as effective, right? So when a car comes rushing at them, when you guys see a car coming rushing at you, your brain is pretty quick. It goes, oh, hit brakes, turn car. Theirs would be like, oh, car, hit brakes, and now you're hit, right? So it gets a little slower processing, guys. I'm going to tell you from experience, getting older sucks. Your body just stops working as well as it used to. Over 65, you should, honestly. You're right. I'm not going to argue with you there. And I'll probably be the one that loses it, but if not over 65, over 70, I think should. They spend more time in. I wonder how much our insurance rates would drop if we did that. You ever wonder that? Would our car insurance rates drop? I mean, you'd still have Florida where old people were driving with people in their windshield, but at least, most of the world, we'd cut it down. You guys know about that story, right? The old person that drove through like 3 SunPass toll terminals with a man sticking out of his windshield. That was fantastic. It's a great story in Florida. As soon as I started reading that story, I'm like, this has got to be Florida. I'm like, yep, Florida man. Florida man strikes again. Everything happens in Florida. I'm sorry if any of you are from Florida, but everything happens in Florida. Man eats other man's face. Got to be Florida. Man shoots bullet up in the sky to see if bullet will fall back down. Dies of gunshot wound. Got to be Florida. They tend to spend more time in stance phase and have longer periods of double support, and they have wider base support, again, to prevent falling. Let's think about falling. So when we are a kid, a child, how do kids fall? Woman feeds husband to lions, exactly, and tigers and bears, oh my. Which way do kids fall, anteriorly or posteriorly? Typically. Actually, kids fall posteriorly. If you watch them, most of the time they fall backwards. Right? Most of the time, for most kids, they fall backwards. And that's basically because of their posterior push of their body, right? If you look at children's walkers, right? So you guys have seen an adult walker. Which way does a child's walker face? Has anyone ever seen a children's walker? So here's little Timmy, right? Children's walkers go behind them because kids tend to fall backwards. That's just kind of the way it is. I think it's due to the fact that most of them have a lot of cushion in their tuition and they're used to falling that way. Think about it as a baby. Which way do we always fall? Babies stand up, babies fall down on butt. Babies stand up, babies fall down on butt. Right? There's that posterior push that they kind of develop as part of a righting mechanism to save them from hurting themselves. Now you start getting into the adult years. Now which way do we start falling? What's the most common fracture that happens? First of all, what's the most fractured body in the human body? What's the most fractured bone in the human body? What is the most fractured bone in the human body? Does anyone know? Dr. Johnson should have covered this for you. No, the most fractured bone is the clavicle. Believe it or not, the clavicle is the most fractured bone in the human body. Now, what is the most fractured bone during a fall for an adult? Now we're talking scaphoid. Okay, so just because I didn't know you guys didn't have this, so we have to cover this because this is a common board question. If the boards ask you what is the most commonly fractured bone, the most commonly fractured bone is the clavicle. And why do you think the clavicle is so commonly fractured? Look at it. Yeah, it's small, it's really fine, it's thin, it's really easy to break. Actually, in the martial arts, that's one of the areas that we're taught to attack because if you break it, it can limit the other person's arm use. And it actually requires very, very little very little force to break it. You can come right down in on it and it'll snap clean in two. And if you do it right, you can poke it down into the lung and give them a lung puncture as well. But that's beside the point. It's a little morbid. But that's the most common. So then we get into what is the most common fractured bone in older and adults that fall. That's the fouche, right? What's fouche stand for? Do you guys know fouche? Fouche. Have you heard that term before? Fouche stands for fall on outstretched hands. Fouche. Fall on outstretched hands. Think about it. When you fall, what's the first thing you do? Ah! You put your hands out, right? Thinking that that's better than hitting your body on the ground. In reality, it's really not, right? And Erica will tell you this because I know Erica's in the martial arts. How do they teach you to fall in the martial arts? Yeah, hit the ground, break fall, right? Slap it down so that you don't go this way, right? Tucking chin, not falling with your face out like this. But fall in outstretched hands for adults, so now we're talking 18 to 65. That's the most common bone fractured in adults 18 to 65 when you're falling, is a fouche fracture, fall on outstretched hands. and it's the scaphoid that breaks, right? Where is the scaphoid at? Is it in the first row or second row of the carpals? Did you guys learn that mnemonic? That's how you remember your bones of your hand, right? So your scaphoid is kind of your big bone. It's kind of that one, and then also the capitate, right? Both of those are kind of your bigger bones of the hand, but scaphoid is the most commonly fractured when you're falling forward. Now, let's change it. What is the most common bone fractured in adults 65 and older during a fall? Hip. So technically, it's usually the femur. It's a fracture of the femoral neck. So do you see the differences there between the fractures? How those three questions could be all on your board and it could screw you up, right? So most commonly fractured bone is what? Clavicle, good. Most commonly fractured bone in an adult in a fall forward. Bush or scaphoid, good, right? Then most commonly fractured bone in an adult 65 and older is the hip, good. All right, see, I taught you something today. Whew, that was rough. All right. So here's a question. What other fracture can a scaphoid fracture cause? So that fall and outstretched hands. There's one other fracture that can cause. You guys know that? Have you guys heard of a Colles fracture? So a Colles fracture, Colin. So I'll type it out here just so that you can see it. Not like border collie. Colles fracture is a posterior displacement fracture of the radius. So as I'm falling down, right, I impact weight here, it pushes, what part of the radius is down here? Is the head of the radius down here? Or where's the head of the radius? The head of the radius is where? Right? So when you fall like this, the force gets transferred into your scaphoid. It pushes all those carpal bones backwards. And then on the back of the hand, the radius breaks upward. And that's a Colles fracture. Right? Now, what do you think a reverse Colles fracture is? You're learning all kinds of things I thought you got in patho, but I guess you didn't. What's a reverse Colles fracture? Yeah, going forward. So the radius fracture is this way. Either way, bad break. They hurt. Right? You got to give them a hand. They did it well. All right. So since we got off on this tangent of fractures, what's a boxer's fracture? So a boxer's fracture is actually where you miss the knuckles and you get a fracture out on this side of the arm. Right? So think about it, when you're trained to box, you're supposed to strike, or the camera's over here, strike direct on with the knuckles. And it's where you come in, and instead of hitting with those knuckles, you come and you catch those outside knuckles. And it can be a fracture of the hamate, it can be a fracture of the pisiform. There's all kinds of things that can happen out there. Can even be up to a fracture of the ulna. Right, so Colles, right? When you're thinking of Colles and scaphoid are on this side, boxers on that side. Just in case you ever have to do ultrasound, because it's really common to do ultrasound on those fractures. right? So, all right, we'll take it one step further because we went off on a tangent here already. How would you do ultrasound on those fractures? What type of ultrasound would you do? If it's a fracture, do we want heating or healing? Healing, good. So what kind of ultrasound is that? Pulse, good. Probably 3.3, great, good, right? And how would you deliver it? What type of medium would you use? Yeah, underwater, good. It's really hard to get an ultrasound head that's gonna be okay on that palm, right? So better to immerse them in a bucket and do ultrasound underwater. Good, all right, so that was a tangent that, woo, well, you learned something, right? If nothing else, you learned something from me today. I am just a plethora of facts that are useless. So back to older adults. So yeah, adults tend to do a wider base support because they are afraid of falling and fracturing that hip. If an older adult falls and fractures their hip, if they're 65 or older, what's the mortality rate? Does anyone know? So when I say mortality, what am I talking about? Yeah, dying. Yeah, actually, Kelly, you're really close. It's about 50%. Think about that for a second. It's about 50% in the next 7 years. Now, was that because they're going to die anyway in 7 years? Or is it because the fracture caused it? But when an adult fractures their hip, it's usually going to lead to bad problems. What would cause them to die earlier? What do you think is going to happen after they break their hip? Could be infection, good, right? But let's say everything surgical-wise goes well. What do you think they're going to stop doing? Yeah, they're going to mobilize. They're going to stop walk, right? And we know that we stop doing things actively, our body starts shutting down, right? It's really interesting. I want to say it was University of Boston, but don't quote me on it. Did a study with correlation with dementia and hip fractures. And now, again, correlation does not equal causation, but they find a high correlation between adults that have hip fractures and early onset dementia. Now, was that because of the anesthesia they got to fix their fracture? Maybe. Or is it because they stopped moving so much so even the brain started shutting down? Right? We said it before, motion is lotion. So research, look at this. Research found a relationship between the possible early screen for dementia via gait analysis, right? Gait apraxia may show up first. If you break out Professor Google, there are plenty of articles, charts, and graphs and national media and peer-reviewed articles out there about this, right? Did you guys learn the difference between apraxia and ataxia in Intro to Kines or in anatomy? Have you heard both those terms at least? Okay. I'm going to give you the 1,000-foot view, and then we will hit it harder when we go into neuro, right? I'm going to give you a simple way to remember it. Okay, so you have apraxia and ataxia, right? The way this, now there are a couple different forms of apraxia. I'm not getting into that yet. Problem with, you type today, plan. Do you see why I capitalized the P? This is the way I remember to tell me get through the boards. Apraxia is a problem with the motor plan. And we haven't talked too much about motor planning yet. We're going to get into that in Therax, right? Wow, my shirt makes really weird things when I move around in the camera. Sorry. Squirrel. So problem with the motor plan, meaning that something in initiating your plan in your brain is messed up. A lot of times it can be cerebral involvement, maybe cerebellar involvement, depending upon what we're dealing with. So the motor plan is that process you put together. Like right now, if I asked all of you, for those of you that drink coffee like I do, if I asked you to close your eyes and brew a cup of coffee, could you brew a cup of coffee? Yeah, I hope for the most part. You might get some coffee on the counter, right? That's just for the dog later or the kids. So you've developed a motor plan to do that, right? If I asked you right now to describe how you got out of bed, do you all have a different way of getting out of bed? Probably, right? You have a plan for getting out of bed. If you have apraxia, that plan gets pulled apart. So you can't initiate the plan to move. Could you imagine that being really frustrated? You know, knowing that yesterday you were able to get up and out of bed and today you can't because you don't know how to do it. Would that be frustrating? Is this lecture frustrating? Okay, good. Ataxia is a taxing problem. And let's explain what I mean by that. Ataxia, the plan is intact, but something in the implementation from when the plan leaves the brain to when it gets to the rest of the body is screwed up. So it's very taxing on your body. It could be a neurological impairment where maybe you're sending the signal down from your spinal cord to or from your brain to your spinal cord, and the spinal cord doesn't send it on because there's damage to the spinal cord. That would be an ataxic problem. It could be a problem with the muscles, that maybe you're so wasted away, you want to sit up, but you can't because the muscles are just completely wasted. That would be an ataxic event, right? With apraxia, all the muscles and the neurological stuff is intact, right? You can do it. Your muscles function, your nerves function, you just lack the plan to do it. Versus ataxia, it's either something below the plan. The plan's in place. You've got, you know, going back to a kind of a football reference, you've got your play sheet. You've got all the play sheets there, but for some reason, you're missing your offensive lineman. Right? And missing those offensive linemen in football would be a bad problem. That's going to be a quarterback sandwich all day long. Does that make sense for those two? Does that help a little bit? Should really move your chat over to the other side so that I'm looking at this and not the, there we go. So does that make sense? It's kind of frying. All right, and we're going to get into, again, we're going to get into kind of heavier stuff where we have to talk more about different types of apraxia and ataxia later. You just have to understand the basics of apraxia versus ataxia for this class. So apraxia, problem with the plan. Ataxia, plan is intact, something else is screwed up. Makes sense? That's as simple as you need to go for right now. Any questions on that? Yeah, so we're gonna talk about some different gait problems that have examples of apraxia and ataxia in a little bit. All right, so here's kind of that walking cycle again, and when you're in support or non-support. If you're working with a patient and you're trying to get them to understand how bad their gait is, what's a good thing you could do in order to show them how bad their gait is? YouTube, right? Or record them, right? Back when I was in PT school, we didn't have one of these fancy, fancy handheld recorder devices in my pocket all day long, right? But now you've got I mean, this camera I think has a 20 megapixel phone has like 20 megapixel camera. It records video in 4K, right? I can take some really awesome video of somebody walking and show them how bad their gait cycle is, right? Because we are kind of not as attentive to ourselves. If somebody tells us our gait cycle screwed up, a lot of times we don't want to believe it because we don't see it, right? So you want to definitely show patients this. Yeah, it finally, literally, I'm not joking, it actually caught fire. I had it plugged in one night, and something happened with a short in the charging port, and I'm sitting in bed, I'm like, hey, that smells like Fire. So I now have the fancy dancy iPhone SE. I wanted to get the 11 Pro until I saw the price. So yeah, it's finally like I broke out a little box. I buried it in my backyard. Gave it its last rites. It's gone. Now I'll have this iPhone SE for the next probably 10 years. Somebody said, well, why didn't you just get the iPhone 11? Well, I don't have friends, so I don't need to take much video. Anyway, so now we're going to talk about some pathological gait patterns. When I say pathological, what does that indicate to you? What does pathological mean? Could be disease-ridden, good, right? The main thing we're talking about gait, exactly. When we're talking about gait, pathological means there's a problem with the gait somewhere. Pathological doesn't necessarily mean you have a disease. Pathological definitely means there's a problem. What you will find with most gait patterns is they're described by the way the muscle, they're described by the position of the trunk over a specific group of muscles. Does that make sense? So looking at this patient here, and we're going to show the video in a little bit. This patient here has what's called a glute max gait. Their trunk is shifted over the buttocks, right? So when you're talking about pathological gait patterns, we're going to talk about glute max gait. Then we're going to talk about hip flexor gait. And then we're going to talk about glute med gait. When we're talking about those different types of gait, it's based upon the way the trunk is shifted. It's also going to be talking about which muscles are affected, right? But the main idea here is the way the trunk is shifted describes the gait, right? So if I'm leaning way forward, what do you think that gait's going to be called? So I'm flexed at the trunk. It's going to be hip flexor gait, right? Or forward gait, exactly. And the forward gait's what I keep on my house. Sorry. I'm going to show the videos in a little bit because I want to show them kind of together. So don't freak out about the videos yet, but the links are up as well if you guys want to watch the videos again. I just want to go through a couple of the gaits first. So with the hip, the gluteus maximus gait, the trunk is going to shift posteriorly at heel strike, right? And tomorrow when we come back to do this class, I'm going to put shorts on and I'm going to walk through the different forms of gait for you so you can kind of see them, right? And this one's probably the easiest one to do because your body's going to be shifted posteriorly at heel strike. So every time you plant down, you're kind of going to do what I call the lurch. You're going to go backwards. Does that make sense? It's also can be called the extensor gait because you're back here in extension. Then we have our glute medius gait, which is also called our Trendelenburg gait, right? Trendelenburg sign you guys learned about. Well, Trendelenburg gait is nothing more than repetitive Trendelenburg signs, right? The body leans over the affected side. In this case, the right side of the pelvis drops when the right leg enters swing phase. So what's happening here, so let's talk through this. Do you guys remember talking about Trendelenburg with Dr. Johnson? Right? So when I pick this foot up, so I'm picking up my right foot to go through swing phase, my pelvis is going to drop. Which muscles, okay, we know the muscle, it's glute med. What side is affected? Yes, the other side, right? It's this glute med over here because it's not pulling to keep this pelvis, not pulling downward so that this end of the pelvis comes up to keep that leg elevated. It's not doing that vertical displacement, right? So when they're picking up, it drops. It's a very distinctive kind of one of these. Every time they pick up their leg, it just drops back down. So if we're working on this patient, what muscles are we going to exercise? The right or the left glute means. It's the right leg we're having problems with. That means it's the left side we're going to exercise. Good, right? So we can have them doing leg abduction activities. We're picking the leg up and out to the side. There's all kinds of exercises we can do with that, right? So when we enter a swing phase, if your side drops when you enter swing phase, it's a problem with the other glute med. Does that make sense? I hope so. It's kind of a difficult concept. But like I said, I'm going to go through and walk through all of these tomorrow for you. I'm a pretty good actor. And my camera, actually, I tested it today. It works out pretty well with the camera. So let me clear those drawings because they're going to go on to the next screen otherwise. And then here we're looking at what we call quadriceps or flexor gait. Now the trunk is bent way forward, right? So going back here to the glute med, right? Two things could be happening here with the glute med gait. We either have a tight muscle or we have a weak muscle. Those are the two things that can lead to these gaits. With the glute med gait, what muscle do you think could be tight? Or glute max gait, I'm sorry, glute max. I'm off track here. With the glute max or the hip extensor gait, what muscle could be tight? The butt, right? Because it's going to pull the trunk that way. Or the opposite could be true, that these muscles are really weak, right? Because if your flexors are weak, they're going to be overtaken by your extensors. Does that make sense? Right? So if one side is weak, the other side will take over for it. And that'll force you into the glute max. Or the other thing is, the glutes could be tight. Now, could it be both? Absolutely. It could be a combination of both, and it'll eventually develop into a combination of both. So that means what we're going to do is we're going to come back here and stretch out their butt, and we're going to strengthen the quads for this gait. Does that make sense? So let's go on to your glute med gait or your Trendelenburg. With this one, we're going to strengthen this side and probably stretch out this side a little bit, because this side's probably gotten tight from all the times of it dropping. So we might have to stretch a little bit. And then going on to the hip flexor gait, again, what muscles do you think would be tight in the hip flexor gait? What muscles do you think would be tight in the hip flexor gait? Yeah, the flexors, right? You can see it. Can you see how tight these are right here? They're short. Iliopsoas almost has no room to go. And then guess what's going to happen to all these? They're going to be stretched out. Right? So we're going to have to strengthen back here, stretch here. Remember I said if you get nothing more than understanding what needs stretched and what needs strengthened, it covers almost all your questions. Remember I said that? Here we are, proof, positive. Right? So it just shows you how easy it is. If you understand the basic concept of stretching one thing, strengthening another, that it leads right into this. We're going to cover genu recurvatum and we'll finish the rest tomorrow. So genu recurvatum, remember I talked about this before. Genu means what? What is that Latin for? Knee, right? Because you need it to walk. This means backwards or draw cab. No one gets it? Draw cab? No, I can't. Hold on. Get it? Draw cab? Backwards. It's so funny. So what's happening in this case here with genu recurvatum is every time you go into stance phase, that knee is going that way, and you're ending up with an angle that looks like this. Every time I see somebody with genu recurvatum, my stomach just goes. This is one of the gaits. What do you call it? One of the gait deviances that I can't handle. I don't know why this one makes me so sick, but just the thought of your knee going backwards like that reminds me of like those dinosaurs on Jurassic Park. But so the knee is going back that way. So it can be caused by a weak hamstring not being able to keep the knee a little bit flexed, right? Or it could also be, if it's a weak hamstring, what's going to be tight? Quads. Could be a really, really tight quad that's really hard forcing that knee into extension, right? And a lot of times these patients, when they go through swing phase, they kind of kick the leg because the knee is so far into extension that they can't unlock it. So a lot of times they'll have a little bit of a kick with it to unlock the knee. They're trying to really fire off. What's the muscle that unlocks the knee? I know you didn't. Yes, popliteus. Yes, right? It's in the popliteal fold. Good. How many of you guys are now going, oh God, I've forgotten all these muscles. Please help me. Anyone feeling that way right now? Okay, that's fair. That's why you'll find that all of this is going to build on each other, right? But do you see, so we're going to be done with this lecture for right now. We'll pick back up tomorrow. I'm going to stop the share here. Right. That's why we're covering it the way I cover it. I know that you guys aren't experts in muscles yet, right? I'm trying to get, because what you learned before, what you guys learned before was this is the action, or this is the origin, this is the insertion, this is the action, this is the innervation. That's all you had to worry about, is just understanding the bicep starts here, it ends here, it does this, and it's innervated by what nerve? What nerve does the biceps? Come on, waking you guys up. One last question here. What nerve? Not radial. It's the long one. Not medial. It's the long word. Musculocutaneous. Right? Let's make it easier. What nerve root is the bicep? C5, C6. Good. See, you got that, right? But that was what you had to learn for anatomy and for intro to kinese. Now we're going to start building on. You guys do have a good foundation for knowing these muscles, even though you feel like you're just got a brain fry. You do have them. They're in there. They may be covered in a little fine sheet of dust, but I'm going to go in and go and blow off that dust and then show you why it was important to learn them. Is that fair enough? But that is it for today.